Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of Roosevelt House, where, as you probably know, many of the initiatives of the New Deal were forged right here in the one-time home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person this evening, but I'm really delighted that you will be learning in a few moments about one New Deal program that has never been spoken about here before, and which I actually didn't know about until I read the book that will be discussed on this stage. What our guest of honor, Cheryl Kaskowitz, truly calls a New Deal, a hidden New Deal program, one that tried to change America and end the Depression through folk music. We're here to learn more about her compelling book, which is called, compellingly, A Chance to Harmonize: How FDR's Hidden Music Unit Sought to Save America from the Great Depression, one song at a time. I guess it should come as no surprise that the same New Deal architects who considered the welfare of writers and painters and the power of their creative impact on a emotionally and financially depressed America thought they could uplift the spirit of the American people through music as well. And we know that on a personal level, Franklin and Eleanor and FDR's mother, who built this house and lived with them, were all fans of music, particularly popular music. In fact, these very walls, to be more specific, the walls upstairs, once reverberated with the sound of a grand Steinway piano that stood in the second floor drawing room on the mother-in-law's side of the house, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Eleanor's mother-in-law. Today it's one of our classrooms. And there was also always the sound of music echoing from the radios that the Roosevelts kept in various rooms of the house. Imagine FDR listening to the radio when it was someone other than himself dominating that medium. I want to digress for a second to one of the musicians whose name will come up in today's discussion, the late, great Pete Seeger, who once performed at a 1944 Valentine's Day party at the United Federal Labor Canteen in Washington. Remember, this was toward the end of World War II, for an audience that included the peripatetic Eleanor Roosevelt. No one ever knew where she would turn up, and here she is at the Federal Labor Canteen, and you're looking at a photograph of that show then. You see Pete in his Army uniform, delighting the First Lady and other members of the military in attendance. For those few of you who don't know who Pete Seeger is, I can't believe there are any of you actually. Think of Turn, Turn, If I Had a Hammer, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, that Pete Seeger. Now, a couple of decades later, Eleanor wrote about Pete Seeger in her My Day column, expressing concern for the legal trouble that he'd gotten himself into due to his political activism. And this is what Eleanor said about Seeger. He's loved by many people, young and old, who have enjoyed his music. The accusation against him that he had performed before very questionable, even communist groups, although I doubt that Seeger, like most performers, could list the innumerable people before whom he had played and sung. Well, despite Eleanor's support, Seeger was eventually convicted of contempt of Congress and blacklisted on radio and television because he refused to name names during the McCarthy era. But the good news is that these convictions were later overturned. I mention him with such passion because I got to meet him several times in the 1970s when I was a political press secretary, and he continued his political activism in the Eleanor tradition until he was in his upper 90s. So now to tell us more about the significance of singers like Pete and the little-known music unit of the New Deal that sought to raise morale through folk music, it's my pleasure to welcome our guests. Cheryl Kaskowitz is the author of, previously, God Bless America, The Surprising History of an Iconic Song. Her other writing has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, Bloomberg News, and other outlets. She earned her PhD in music with an ethnomusicology focus. I had to read that, from Harvard, and she's lectured at Brandeis and Brown. She lives in Berkeley, California, and we could not be more pleased that she has traveled all the way from the West Coast to be with us at Roosevelt House tonight. Her interlocutor is, I'm equally pleased to say, Scott Borchert. We hosted Scott for a virtual Roosevelt House program during the pandemic to explore his powerful book, Republic of Detours, How the New Deal Paid Broke Writers to Rediscover America. So he's a perfect conversant with Cheryl on the subject of music, having written about the arts in the New Deal as well. We're delighted he's here too. And now it's a pleasure for me to turn the proceedings over to our guests. So please join me in absentia in welcoming Cheryl Kaskowitz in conversation with Scott Borchert.
This book tells the story of something called the Music Unit, which is part of the Resettlement Administration from the New Deal. I think if anyone knows a little bit about this Resettlement Administration, they know the Photography Unit, which is this very famous group of photographers who went out to document the American landscape in the 1930s. People like Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, creating some of the most enduring, iconic images of the Great Depression. I had no idea that such a thing as the Music Unit also existed alongside this Photography Unit. And in fact, the Music Unit is kind of a semi-secretive, semi-clandestine thing. We'll get into why that was so. But the story is just really remarkable. I read Cheryl's book and thought it was so fascinating and so, nicely told that it totally just opened up this whole history for me. So I figured we should start maybe by just talking about the Resettlement Administration itself. And Cheryl, if you don't mind just explaining what it was, what its mission was, and who was, Rex Tugwell, the guy who was kind of in charge of the whole thing.
Yes, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with Scott. If you all aren't familiar with his book, our books are in conversation with one another. So it's just great to be in actual conversation. And to be talking about the New Deal with people who are as excited about the New Deal as we are. So the Resettlement Administration came about in 1935. It was a moment, same era when the WPA came into being, 1935. And it was a reorganization of all of these disparate programs that had come before it, focusing mostly on the rural poor. And it had a very experimental edge to it. So the Rural Resettlement Division was tasked with resettling people they were called, populations that were just completely isolated from an ability to work. So you have miners where the mines had shut down, you had farmers whose land had failed, and you had urban workers who were essentially stranded in their cities with no opportunity to work. And so this idea was, let's give them a chance to start over. And so they created these homesteads built from scratch where they were going to be given the chance to farm, to work along a sort of, and this is the experimental part, this idea of a cooperative focus, an ethic. And so cooperative farms, cooperative factories. And this was all part of probably, the most progressive lane of the New Deal that was led by Rexford G. Tugwell. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, one of the best names. If you've seen the pictures from my book, one of the most handsome. He was known as the most handsome of the brain trusters. So he was a a Columbia economics professor who became an advisor to President Roosevelt. And this was his vision was, we need to make this shift towards something that's more cooperative, more away from the rugged individualism and towards a focus on community and towards these, he was thinking of it in terms of economics, so these cooperative enterprises. So you can imagine there was perhaps some pushback from people who knew about what that ideological goal was. But what it looked like was they were setting up these new communities, usually in unincorporated rural areas. Sometimes they were, just outside of a city, and people were invited to apply and start over.
So as the Resettlement Administration started setting up these communities, how did they ever get the idea that, an integral part of their mission would be folk music?
Yeah, it's true. Well, I think it starts, and the prologue to my book starts in Key West, Florida, because I think that is where Tugwell first got the idea that the arts could play a role in this. And because Key West, as some of you know, was set up as a tourist destination during the New Deal. And part of what they did was bring artists from all over the country to go paint murals on many surfaces and make postcards, do brochures and things like that. But they also had choirs, and they put on a production of The Pirates of Penzance, and all of it ostensibly for tourists. But Tugwell and others saw that the arts also raised morale in the communities and brought them together. And so he recruited Adrian Dornbush, who was a painter turned administrator he led the arts programs in Key West, and Tugwell said, do what you did in Key West on these homesteads. And so it started out like that. And it always takes me a while to get to the music part, but music had been in the language at the beginning, but it wasn't in practice until the first couple of months. And this is where this shared character, and Scott in my book, Catherine Kellock, who later went on to lead the Federal Writers Project, but she was sent out as part of the Resettlement Administration, and they were working in this division called the Special Skills Division, which I think was purposefully vague, right? And we'll get to that a little bit more. So she was sent out to find out how things were going. This is a couple months in, and she discovered that things were not going very well. Morale was very low. The construction of these houses was much slower than they had anticipated. She said people were living in their chicken coops while their houses were being built. She said people were not feeling in community with the new people who came from all over, and they didn't know, and they all had gone through this trauma of the Great Depression, and now were stuck, living in their chicken coops. And so she wrote back pretty definitively that she had spoken with the directors of these homesteads, and across the board, what people were asking for was music. Send in music leaders. We need them. And so the folk music part comes a little later. They didn't, in order to find somebody who would run this program, they recruited Charles Seeger, who was living in New York, in Greenwich Village, and he was just at the beginning of understanding the power of folk music. A lot of people were at this time, in terms of seeing it as a vehicle for like the folk, for expression of the people. And so he came in, so this is, let's see, resettlement starts in April 1935. He comes in November of 1935 and decides that if the music is going to be used as a vehicle to unify the people, it needs to come from them. And he had this belief that it needed to be, that would be the strongest thing, would be folk music. The older, the better, is what he said.
I want to read something that Charles Seeger wrote in a second, but about Catherine Kellogg. I'm glad you mentioned her because, like you said, when I was writing about the Federal Writers Project, I focused on her a little bit because I thought, oh, this is this remarkable and really overlooked figure who was this pivotal editor for the Federal Writers Project and oversaw the Tor portions of their guidebooks that were really their main like aesthetic achievement. So I really wanted to tell her story, and I thought she was this really amazing person. And then I read Charles' book, and I was like, oh, wow, and she also invented this other thing, the music unit, from the Resettlement Administration when she was there for like 3 months or something. So it just goes to show you there are all these remarkable people who were part of the New Deal at these lower levels who are doing this incredible work that really you kind of have to dig to find. And that's something you do really well in this book. And we're going to get to some of the other people too. But Charles Seeger, so one thing I love in this book, this detail of his transformation into someone who was really enthusiastic about folk music. He went from someone who was writing these like atonal modernist compositions that would sort of spur the working class to seize the means of production, he thought. And then while he got involved with the Resettlement Administration, he became this convert to the power of folk music. And so that was kind of the idea that propelled him, it seemed like.
Yeah, absolutely. So it came out of the Composers Collective here in New York. It's the same place where Blitzstein's Cradle Will Rock came from. It was this idea that modernism was the voice of the revolution. And so, and I do have an example of one of the songs that Charles Seeger wrote under an alias. But they were definitely connected to the Communist Party, and there were these strong connections. And he actually just discovered folk music, I would say just a couple months before he was recruited to come down, where, I am blanking on the, Aunt Molly Jackson came here, and she sang the songs. She was a union organizer in Kentucky. She sang the songs where she was taking these classic melodies and adding, protest lyrics to them in her way. This sort of not classically trained, let's say. So she sang those, and then these avant-garde composers played their atonal works. And so there's this, just completely bewildered by each other. But he said later, and I don't know how long it took him, but for him to really say, wait a minute, people can sing her songs, right? But they, and they know them, and they have meaning for them, and so she's on the right path. And that's what he came to the music unit with.
So I just want to read really quickly something you quote here. This is from Seeger. He's setting up the unit, and he writes this instruction manual, I guess, basically, this list of instructions for people he's going to send out into the field. And so this was kind of the mission of the music unit, to regard music as a social function, to direct it towards certain definite social goals as an activity of masses of people rather than merely of isolated individuals. These should be his main concern, as in these are the representatives going out. That should be their main concern. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I already shared with Scott that I, as an ethnomusicology grad student, I actually read a lot of Charles Seeger's work. And so this is a bit of my revenge, to try to show that he said things in a way that did not need to be said in that way. So, but you know, it makes it sound very important. Yeah, he's basically saying we are using music to get people to move towards thinking of themselves as a community, moving towards something together. And so this idea of what is the role of music as being the most important, as opposed to, you know, and really any other aspect.
So Charles Seeger was this pivotal figure in your story, and as he got the unit set up, he started hiring people and sending them out into the field. And the two kind of key people for your book are two women, Margaret Valiant and Sydney Robertson. And I just thought we should really talk about them because in some ways you chose to organize this book around their experiences and to tell the story through their eyes, not just give you like a bird's eye view of the music unit and what they did. So they're really these remarkable people, and like Catherine Kellogg, you know, people who are kind of unknown to most people. You have to go digging through the archives to really get their stories and to learn more about them, and that's what you did. So Margaret Valiant, who was she? How did she get involved with the music unit, and what did she do when she got there?
Yes. So this book, in one iteration, was actually called Government Song Women. So yeah, it definitely was coming from their experience. Margaret Valiant was born in Como, Mississippi. She was, I call her a chameleon. She had this incredible ability to come into new places, charm everyone there, make amazing friends who would bring her to new places, you know, and just that's how she built her life. And so she escaped from, well, she calls it escaped. So she moved from the South. She went to the conservatory in Cincinnati. She started on piano. She, you know, and she's coming from very, she didn't have a lot of money. She talks about paying her way through the conservatory by playing organ at the theater down the street, and then met these amazing people who just propelled her, who wanted to help her. And so the head of the of Cincinnati Conservatory invited her to come to her house in the Berkshires for the or the Adirondacks, one of those mountainous, beautiful places where wealthy people went, and basically hired her to come and entertain. And so that's where she met even more people, including Margaret Sanger. That's a thread that I did not go into in my book. Someone else can write that book. But she, at that time, was married to a very wealthy man. And so she discovered her voice. She started to study opera. These wealthy friends arranged for her to go to Paris. She studied at the conservatory there. She sang, you know, on opera stages. She learned how to play the guitar. She's unbelievable. And she has left not enough of a trace. And the way that she came into Charles Seeger's life was actually through Ruth Crawford Seeger, who, well, at that time she was Ruth Crawford, who herself here's another woman, there's a theme, so she is an avant-garde composer, had been in Europe on a fellowship. They met on a ship coming back to New York, became close friends, and when Charles Seeger took the job in Washington, she went along. And she was the only woman who was, he hired her as a music representative, which meant she was sent out to one of these homesteads to facilitate this musical transformation that was going to happen. So the idea was go out, he said the first thing you should do is make friends. Find the musicians, become friends with them, and he basically left it up to his representatives about how to do it. But she had all of the right attributes, basically. She knew where a lot of these people were coming from. She was sent to Cherry Lake, Florida, which is right on the northern border. And as soon as she went there, she found, that they had like a front porch band that people who played music had already started because they wanted to play music together. She befriended those people, turned it into, they called it an orchestra, it was a dance band. She, led teen music nights. She, and again, she had this superpower charisma. And so she was the only woman, and she was by far the most successful of these music representatives.
You have a great story where one of the first things she did to try to gain the trust of the people in Cherry Lake Farms was to get all the kids together, the teenagers. And you can tell this story, but what she came up with, this kind of remarkable exercise that just showed how creative she was, but also how musically talented she was to pull something like this off. And maybe you can tell everyone.
Yes. So, and again, this is this combination of the charisma and the musical chops. And because some of what she says is that when she arrived, a lot of the adults assumed that she was there to teach music lessons to their children. And so she was doing some of that in the schools, but she really wanted to get the young people behind what she was doing. But she knew that she couldn't just, offer to teach piano lessons. So she had this teen music night, or, young person's music night. And again, this is a place where they were very behind in terms of construction. People didn't have a lot of things to do. The other thing about Cherry Lake that I think is important to think about is it was one that was actually recruiting people from cities. So these are young people who had been living in urban places who are now in the middle of nowhere in northern Florida. And so she invites them to come, and everyone, when they came in, had to write a note on the board, even if they didn't know what a musical note was. And so then they had this string of notes. And now it's hard to remember exactly what she was doing, but basically, and people had to come up with a melody that was their melody, and then she was sitting at the piano and she would harmonize it for them. And so then she split them up into teams, and they needed to take the melody on the board and write a song to it. And then she, made some of them judges to see who won. And it was astounding. So it was that kind of energy that she brought to the work.
We actually have a few songs we're going to play tonight. And so the first song is one that she recorded. And I thought, we can get into this whole other side of the music unit, which was going out and actually creating recordings of people at these homesteads and around the country. So we don't have to get into the details of that. Maybe save that for the next person. But this next song is one that Margaret recorded herself. It was actually at an FSA camp in California. FSA, of course, the Farm Security Administration, which was the new name of the Resettlement Administration. And there's no New Deal story without these great changing names and shifting acronyms and stuff like that. I think at one point you say the Resettlement Administration turned into the Farm Security Administration, and its kind of bureaucratic initials on the paperwork was KL, because why not?
Right.
So it's one of those stories. So this is when it was the FSA. These were the migrant camps in California, like John Steinbeck wrote about in Grapes of Wrath. She was going through these camps recording people. And so we have a song called Going Down the Road Feeling Bad, which some of you might know in other iterations later on. And so we're going to play that for you now. I'm going down that road feeling bad. I'm going down that road feeling bad. And maybe
Trotting on my knees, I'm sticking, trotting on my knees. I'm sticking, trotting on my knees, and ain't gonna be treated this way. We asked the farmer for a raise. We asked the farmer for a raise. We asked the farmer for a raise, and ain't gonna be treated this way.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so that's Margaret Valiant. She's one half of this story. The other half of the story, the version you tell, is Sydney Robertson. So if you could tell us a little bit about her too, how she got involved with the project and what she was doing, because her role there was somewhat different than what Margaret was doing, at least initially.
That's right, yes. And so Sydney Robertson, they were actually, she and Margaret were the same age, but otherwise very different. She grew up from a wealthy family in San Francisco and had been in New York working at the settlement house in the Lower East Side, the Henry Street settlement. And that is another thing, this connection between the settlement movement and the resettlement administration. And came down to Washington thinking that she'd like a government job, found Charles Seeger. She also had a music background. She had played piano, and she knew some of the same people as Charles Seeger, and happened into his office. And at just about the same time that the office was getting some recording equipment, because the idea was not only does it need to be folk music, it needs to be the most authentic, as he saw it, folk music that they could find. And so he felt the only way to do that, to know what that was, is to go out and record it. And so the story is that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt were the ones who interceded in the budget office, when they got a request for the Resettlement Administration to buy this somewhat new recording equipment. Like, why would they possibly need it? And the story is, he said, just let them have the recording machine. And so she came and was soon given a chance to go out and record. And so she went out, she was the one who made most of their recordings.
Yeah, and she did a lot of recording trips all around the country too. She wasn't just going to the homesteads.
Right,
She was going
right.
out to,
Yeah, and the idea was not just on the homesteads, but in the communities where the homesteads, where the people came from. That was sort of the idea. But then once she was on the road on her own in her own car, she pretty much did what she wanted, and so she went out on some side trips, which I think is where she recorded some of the most interesting stuff.
So we have another song here. This one's called Sharon. It's by a group led by Tink Queer, who plays fiddle, and I think 2 other people who were playing with him. Maybe we can hear the song first, and then you can tell us a little bit about it. And at the very end, well, this is the one, right, where you hear Sydney speaking.
Yeah, if we listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, if we listen to the whole thing, you'll hear her talking at the end and kind of introducing the song.
The first tune on this side is the Mississippi Sawyer. The second one is Old Sharon. On the other side are Bully of the Town, Golden Slippers, and Turkey in the Straw, in that order. They were all played at Ligonier, Pennsylvania, on November 10, 1936, by Tink Queer, fiddler, Franklin Slater, and Bill Fowler, guitars. This performance was for the Special Skills Division of the Resettlement Administration. This record is not for commercial use. It will be deposited in the Library of Congress for purposes of scientific research and for the use of the United States government.
Thank you. That's Sydney at the end speaking there. So I wanted to ask you about this kind of dynamic surrounding the music unit, where on the one hand you had this kind of pervasive interest in folk music and folk culture throughout the New Deal, and especially, like we said, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt personally were very interested in this kind of stuff. All kinds of administrators throughout the whole New Deal structure were enthusiastic about collecting folk songs and encouraging what they saw as folk culture. But on the other hand, the music unit operated in this kind of semi-secretive state, and they kept a lot of things from even other administrators there. They had all these confidential memos they were sending back and forth. They didn't want people to know about the recording trips. So why was it existing in this kind of dual state where on the one hand it seemed like the perfect thing that the New Deal should be doing, and on the other hand they didn't want anyone else to know about it?
Yeah, well, I think one thing just in general is that the Resettlement Administration was under fire from the very beginning. Rexford G. Tugwell was called Rex the Red, and everything he did was scrutinized. And so just in general, the Resettlement Administration was seen as representing all of the things that critics disliked about the New Deal. So you have, this overspending, you have, government overreach, bloat, so basic level. Then, and I think this is something that you found also, the idea about the government being involved in the arts in any way and support for that was also just a sort of ripe source for criticism. And so they tried to be quiet about all of the art because there still was painting and other kinds of arts that were happening as well. But the music unit in particular was very much intertwined with these ideological goals in terms of, they called it, Adrian Dornbush told Charles Seeger, basically, it's propaganda if such a thing can be made respectable. So this idea of sort of respectable propaganda towards a community-oriented shift in American ideology was maybe something that they didn't want to be that open about. And so I think those are all of the reasons.
We have actually two more songs we're going to play, and they both kind of capture different elements of these, contradictions that were kind of embodied in the music project. So the first song is called Mr. Roosevelt. It's by Will Wright, recorded by Sydney Robertson, I think, when she was out on one of these recording trips. And so if we could play that one, we'll listen to it, and then maybe you can tell us about the song and who sang it and what, they're trying to convey.
Well, I want to sing Mr. Roosevelt now. I thank Mr. Roosevelt for the good that he has done. He gave a many poor men, and he saved so many lives. Mr. Roosevelt, the second day of November, I fell down on my knees, Lordy God.
Yeah, so Will Wright was in Clinton, Arkansas, and this was part of Sydney's big solo road trip that she took, and this was the beginning of her going off and doing what she wanted. And it's something that I grapple with in the book, and really anybody who writes about this period needs to grapple with is segregation. Because the homesteads where the music unit was working were all white and working within the Jim Crow South. That's where they were located. And so this recording is one of the few of Black singers, and it just represents something really special that she was able to capture because Clinton, Arkansas was right up against an all-Black town that she went to try to see what music was happening because of her own interest. So this wasn't necessarily to go and bring back to the homestead. So this is what I mean about, the recordings were kind of taking on a life of their own. And the other thing about it is she flagged it as one that needed to be played for FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt when she got back, because there was this idea that because of their intercession to get the recording equipment, she was looking for a kind of greatest hits to bring back and play for them.
And then what actually happened when this song was finally played at the White House?
Right. So then she talks about how Charles Seeger actually didn't invite her to go to the White House to play it for her. So she didn't get a chance to talk about her experience or meet the Roosevelts. Yes, and another theme that runs through my book.
I have, I wrote down a much longer quotation. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's actually from Margaret when she was 75, and she wrote, you have in here this unpublished memoir. And she basically makes the point that she was asked to do this work for, what'd she say, this very strenuous, serious work, and she got minimum pay for maximum effort. And Charles Seeger got maximum pay plus all the credit. So that's kind of a good example of how that worked out at the White House.
And Sidney said something like, Charlie, because they called him Charlie, and I call him Charlie in the book. But Charlie never could seem to realize that there was a difference between coming up with the idea of the work and doing the work yourself. So.
And I just want to mention too, before we get on to the last song, there's a great moment in this book, and you do this really well. I think this is part of the storytelling aspect, is that you kind of like home in on these great telling incidents, that just sum up so much of what was going on with the project and the themes you're trying to convey. And you talk about how Margaret, her first kind of triumph at Cherry Lake Farms is putting together this production. And this was going to be the people there, did it themselves, directed it themselves, came up with the idea, did everything except for her, just guiding it a little bit. And so it was kind of going to be this triumphal grassroots expression of, democratic art, basically. And what was the show that they actually put on?
Yeah, they chose to do a blackface minstrel show. And it felt that way when I, really realized that that's what was happening. And it gets down to this tension around so much in the New Deal and finding a way through. And also just a reminder that those things persisted much longer than I think we want to admit.
And it's like there are a lot of examples in this book of how these New Deal programs kind of accommodated the prevailing racial order in the South and across the country in the 1930s. And I saw that with the Federal Writers Project, too. It's inescapable. But at the same time, you also saw these different projects kind of intersecting with the radical labor movement of the time. And so our last song that we're going to play kind of is a good example of that. This is from another recording trip when she was definitely off of her, approved route. It's called Rockabye Baby, and it was recorded in St. Louis, I believe. And we'll listen to that. It's pretty short, and then you can tell us about the context.
Rockabye baby, rockabye baby on the treetop. When you grow up, you work in the shop. When you get married, your wife will work too, so that the rich will have nothing to do. Rockabye baby on the treetop. When you grow old, your wages will stop. When you have spent the little you saved, first to the poorhouse, then to the grave.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite recordings. And Sidney took a special trip. It would have been difficult to explain why she was in St. Louis, a major city. And it was specifically to record these labor protest songs. And she and Charles Seeger had this interest in understanding how the labor movement used music, because they were interested in its power to unite. And so, so she took this special, incredibly confidential trip to St. Louis, where the painter Joe Jones had assembled these protesters. And yeah, so I had a hard time tracking down the. She didn't write an official report. She wrote a letter that she sent to the home, not even of Adrian Dornbush, but to his assistant. So so they knew, that they needed to be quiet about it. But I think that she really did realize on this trip the power of using a familiar song like that everyone knew the melody to, and then having these sort of gut punch lyrics, brought their message home.
So just kind of to wrap it up here, then we'll open it up to some questions from everyone. This story is obviously very intrinsically interesting, and it tells us a lot about how the New Deal got involved with all these different cultural projects, how it became, tangled up in the quest to kind of uncover folk culture in the United States or invent these ideas of a pure folk culture, and got caught up in all these kind of contradictions there. So that's just a great story in and of itself, and it has these remarkable people in it. But you also kind of conclude the book by saying it helped sow the seeds for the folk revival that was still to come. And we started out tonight hearing about Pete Seeger, who is a great figure in that, and he has obviously this direct connection to your story through his father, but he was also sort of involved himself in a little bit. So could you just tell us about how the music unit, which was this secretive thing when it was going on, ended up laying the groundwork or helping to lay the groundwork for the folk revival that was to come?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that so Pete Seeger was Charles Seeger's son. He was a teenager at this time. And when you look at the history of the folk revival, it's usually connected to Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax together, the Seeger-Lomax alliance. And so I kind of see the work that Margaret and Sydney, I call them the godmothers of the folk revival, because they were collecting these songs, first, before Alan Lomax had. And for those of you who are familiar with this, John Lomax actually did play a part in training Sydney. So there's all kinds of connections. The songs themselves would be in the Seeger's house. So they would be listening to the recordings, they would play them. And I really do just feel like, you can see the fingerprints. All is the way that I end up putting it. If you look closely, Pete Seeger went back to some of the songs that Charles Seeger had been using and put them in some of their compilations, and so yeah, I think it's an important prequel to what people think about as the history of the folk revival.
All right, great. Well, now we can take some questions from the audience if anyone has any questions. I should say, if you do have a question, they have microphones for you because there are a lot of people watching at home and they're recording this. So if you ask a question, please wait for a microphone and then you can speak directly into the microphone. All right.
Hi, I was wondering if you had come across the name John W. Work in any of your research?
Yes.
Yes?
I have.
I knew of him as the, director of the Fisk Jubilee Singers and then ultimately chairman of the music department at Fisk University. But his project, I believe, had been funded by Harvard to go into the rural South and record some of the black artists.
Yes.
And he found Muddy Waters and did those initial recordings. Just whatever you learned about him.
Yeah, I didn't know if was it connected to the New Deal, his work, because I'm not sure that I came across his name in terms of this kind of public collecting, but I am familiar with it. And I did come across in my research someone similar. So what happened was, as the Resettlement Administration became the Farm Security Administration, the music unit went away in an official capacity. But I did find some correspondence from someone at one of the segregated black homesteads who was doing this work, so I can't speak directly to John Work's connection, but clearly that was something that was one of the blind spots for the music unit because they were working within the segregated system.
Hi. Did Woody Guthrie fit into this whole narrative at all, or where was he when all this was going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the exact timing of it, and he didn't come up in my research, but clearly, he and Pete Seeger would be connecting soon, and the song that we played, the Going Down the Road Feeling Bad, came to be associated with him. That was something, when I thought about this project, I thought that I would be going deeper into the songs themselves and where they went, and then I just got captivated by the music unit. So that was sort of an area I didn't really get to dive into. So next book.
I should say you do tell the story for the real hardcore folk fans about Bascom Lamar Lunsford, who was this folk singer and I don't know how you describe him, folklorist, I guess. He put on folk festivals.
Yeah.
He worked for the unit for a little while.
Yeah, and that there's a story about the beginning of the folk revival of Lunsford is the one who introduced Pete Seeger to the 5-string banjo, but no one acknowledged that the reason Pete Seeger was at the folk festival was because Charles Seeger had basically called like a music unit field trip, and they were all there. So that's another important connection.
Yeah, it's funny because you talk about him and just someone you might expect to join the unit, and then it's like Nicholas Ray, the director. Yeah. It's like, oh, he also worked for them.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way. There are all of these crazy connections, like Jackson Pollock's older brother. So yeah.
Yes, I want to ask you, because I know somebody who did the recordings for Alan Lomax and Pete Seeger in a government van in the Depression in the South that are now in the Smithsonian. And I wanted to ask, how are these part of that Smithsonian Folkways collection? Where are the recordings that you played for us kept? And so something did happen later. I mean, it was still the Depression when the person I know was doing recordings for the government. So there was another music effort. How did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was, as far as I know, the first effort, the earliest effort. And these recordings are at the Library of Congress in the American Folklife Center. And Sydney actually went back in the early 1940s and is the one who cataloged them. So this idea kind of planted that seed also, and so then there were other efforts that the Lomaxes were involved in, and that Charles Seeger was involved in. The Federal Writers Project did some, So it is at the beginning of those, but it's separate.
Yeah, hi. I'm just a little unclear. It sounded like you said they were drawing jobless people from the cities to these remote settlements. And so is this like the Fresh Air Fund, or what's going on there?
So each settlement, and depending on where it was, had a different population that they were drawing from. So the Cherry Lake Farms was one that was people from cities could apply. So Tampa, and that was mostly Florida cities, could apply if they were willing. They said that, if you have any farm background or an interest in, getting back to the land, because that was another piece of it, and something that connected with the Roosevelts also had an interest in that. And then there were some that were in the Appalachians that were mostly miners or mostly lumber workers. There was one in Arkansas that was for farmers. And so, yeah, the one in Arkansas, yeah. So it each one was kind of focused on a different population that they were trying to help, depending on the region.
And I should say, if we had more time to get into the details of all this stuff, it'd be great. But you spent some time talking about how on the individual homesteads there are these rifts between people from different backgrounds and what their position was, because some of them were like managers and some were just homesteaders who worked there. Some were people from the communities who got jobs there in some cases. And then the music unit people were like thrown into this and had no idea what was going on and caught up in all these really complex, antagonisms. Can you very briefly kind of just tell us?
Yes, I mean, I think that's the other thing is that Margaret had, that she already she was coming in from Washington, but she had Southern roots, and so she had that. But one of Charles Seeger's friends, actually, he tried to convince other people from the Composers Collective to come and do this, and he just convinced one. So this was a Jewish guy from New York who was sent to Red House in West Virginia, and I think they were mostly lumber workers. And yeah, there was a bit of a culture clash, and that's something, just the theme, another theme in terms of all of that, the class, rural versus urban, and the class distinctions and all of that just come to the fore on these homesteads.
Yes, hello. What happened to the settlements, and did any people from the settlements become musicians or record, going out and playing?
Yeah, the settlements all sort of, they followed different paths. They were after the war, they were mostly privatized in various ways. Some of them really stayed communities. There's one that I visited in Crossville, Tennessee, Cumberland Homesteads, that still has some of their old buildings, and they have a museum and people who have lived there for generations. Cherry Lake Farms doesn't really exist anymore. There are a couple of scattered homes that are there. It's funny what you say about the musicians, because the music unit wasn't necessarily focused on, it's certainly, I've had current musicians ask me, why weren't they paying the musicians on the homesteads? And that just wasn't part of their mission. But Margaret Valiant had this amazing knack for finding really talented musicians. She recorded a fiddler, Russell Wise, who ended up playing, now he's in the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. She found, she recorded the King family, who went, they're the band in the John Steinbeck Grapes of Wrath movie. She recorded, so I feel like each one of these homesteads is its own story in a way. And Johnny Cash grew up on a homestead, actually, not one that, so he didn't interact with the music unit, but so it's hard to sort of draw those like straight connections, but yeah, again, just wonderful links.
All right, we had another question over here. I'll bring the microphone around.
Thank you. I'm sorry, did you say that it was Pete Seeger or his dad who started out as a modernist classical composer?
So Charles Seeger. Charles Seeger was, avant-garde. He was a musicologist, taught at Berkeley, and then he taught at Juilliard, and he was an ultra-modern avant-garde atonal composer. And then made this shift. And so, Pete Seeger he does have some musical training, and they bring that a bit to their approach to folk music, I think.
All right, do we have any more questions? Back over here.
I was hoping that maybe a timeline might help me to understand this. I mean, the level of desperation to get people to move to why for nothing, where, who knows? It sounds like it was set up to fail.
Oh.
And it's hard for me to understand that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he must have had a motive. You know, I mean, I think I never realized how awful the Depression was. I mean, my parents told me stories, but I mean, I can't imagine, you know, and some of the names you've mentioned are like people that I've heard of, I mean, who managed to make it to some level. But from doing all this research, can you give me an idea of what were the major issues that were missed that caused it to fail? Or do you think it failed?
Yeah. Well, if you read any of the, most of the histories of the Resettlement Administration were written in the 1950s. And I feel like they were a product of that time in focusing on it as a failure, as a model of a failure. So they had these hopes for it. They thought that it would expand. They wanted to give this idea a chance to try it out. Economically, you know, you can't actually, it was too difficult to start up a factory from nothing during the Depression. So economically, they couldn't make it work. That was the histories were written then. Sorry. So 1935, and some of them had been, some of these had already started, and that's something that, you know, it's hard to, some of these came under the Resettlement Administration that had been built and started under other, you know, New Deal programs. So you have people who, I just want to make sure, are you asking also about why people would move there, or are you just asking like why did they think it was going to succeed? Okay. I mean, I think if you, so the impetus for the very first one was Lorena Hickok going out and seeing the, you know, the miners, the ex-miners living in just utter poverty, like that no one could imagine. And I think this idea of a stranded population was because there were no alternatives. There were no options to get other jobs. And so I think the idea was we need to build them something so that, and we as a government, you know, we need to step in when people are suffering to that degree. And so they applied that same idea to farmers whose land had just completely failed and they lost everything, right? And then you have people in cities who have absolutely no opportunity to work. And so they're in bread lines, they might be getting, you know, they're on the dole, so they might be getting some relief, but people really were desperate. And then I think in terms of the success of it, you know, it was incredibly ambitious and experimental and, you know, radical, you could say. And it just required more support. I think that they had to choose their battles. And so there was a shift towards away from relief and towards work. And that's what the WPA, so I kind of think about it in the spring of 1935, there were these two seeds planted, so WPA and the Resettlement Administration. Resettlement Administration became the Farm Security Administration. They kept doing some of what they were doing, but most people, when you say New Deal, they think WPA, and that's really what expanded and what moved forward. Yeah, well, the way I think of it is that WPA was focused on putting people to work. This was focused on using music to help a particular community of people. And so maybe it didn't have the legs that the WPA did. We can talk about it more. It's complicated.
So I think probably should wrap it up around here. Let me just end by asking you a question, just kind of based on that question that I'm thinking about now. In a way, the Resettlement Administration was this, hugely ambitious, bold thing that didn't really work out in the end. And the music unit was this totally harebrained scheme that they tacked onto it that they had to keep a secret because they thought it was like so ridiculous that no one would support it. But in a way, it actually worked for what it was designed to do. Even though the broader program didn't, would you say the music unit was successful for what they kind of set out to do?
Well, sure.
Trying to be optimistic about it.
I mean, I feel like that the fact that the government was willing to put its belief in the power of music was, something to me is incredible to think about now. And if you listen to some of the recordings, especially like the ones that Margaret made, where she's really capturing this joy that she's trying to bring to people by having them play music for each other. And so did it work? Are we in a cooperative society? No. But I think, I think that idea of planting the seeds that's come up a couple times is definitely in play.
And we got a lot of great recordings out of it, and now we have this wonderful book, which I hope everyone will go read and buy, more importantly. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Cheryl, of course, for coming all the way from California. Thank you, Roosevelt House, for hosting us.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thanks,
My pleasure.
everybody.